All right, welcome back everyone to the Deep Dive. And today, we're going to be looking into childhood trauma and its lasting effects on our mental well-being as adults.
Yeah.
So we've got a great source that we're going to be pulling from today.
Right.
And it's this could be really interesting, right? I think a lot of people think of childhood trauma as something that, happened to them.
Yeah.
But they don't always realize how it could be affecting them years later,
Absolutely. Yeah. It's something that, can really impact us in ways we don't even realize, like it's not always something that's top of mind, but it's definitely there under the surface.
Right. And so the source that we have here, it identifies some specific types of trauma. And I think it would be good for you to kind of go over those.
Sure. Yeah. So some of the key ones that are mentioned here are things like emotional neglect.
Right.
Right. So that's that lack of emotional support or validation that we need early on in life. Then you have physical or emotional abuse, which is pretty self-explanatory, right?
Yeah.
Experiencing harm, constant criticism, that kind of thing. Also, loss or abandonment, that deep sense of being unsupported or actually losing a caregiver.
Right.
And then lastly, exposure to violence or instability in your early environment. So just growing up in a chaotic or unsafe environment.
That's a lot.
It is.
Yeah.
And
one of the things that this source really emphasizes is that these experiences can actually impact brain development, the way our bodies respond to stress, our ability to regulate emotions.
Wow.
All of these things are kind of shaped.
It makes sense, right? If you grow up in a chaotic environment and you're constantly on edge,
right,
that's got to affect your brain and your body somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. It becomes your normal.
Right.
So then as you grow up, you carry those patterns with you.
And it makes you think, what about all the adults walking around? Right.
Yeah. What are some of the ways that these early experiences might show up in our lives today? Let's talk about, what are the lasting effects, the so what?
Right, the so what. Yeah. And so, some of the things that the source mentions are, things like anxiety and depression.
Right.
Which makes sense. Right. If you've had those unresolved experiences, it can lead to that chronic worry, that persistent sadness, those feelings of worthlessness, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like you're always kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Right. Exactly. You're on high alert all the time.
Yeah.
And that takes a toll.
So it affects our inner world, right? Mm-hmm. But then what about our relationships? How does this impact our connections with other people?
So, one of the things the source really emphasizes is that early trauma can make it really hard to form and maintain healthy relationships, you might find yourself struggling with trust, being afraid of abandonment, or even emotionally detaching from people as a way to protect yourself, right?
Right, because you've learned that, people can hurt you.
Exactly.
And it's not safe to, let your guard down.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a defense mechanism and it's a natural response.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to see those patterns play out,
Yeah, absolutely.
And another thing that the source mentions is self-esteem.
Yeah.
Right? It makes sense, right? If you grew up with a lot of neglect or criticism, it's going to affect how you view yourself.
Right. It can lead to that feeling of inadequacy, that you're not good enough, not worthy, all of those things.
Right. Right. And I think it's also interesting that the source connects this to emotional dysregulation.
Yes.
Right. Which I think for a lot of people, they might not know what that means.
Right.
It basically, having trouble managing.
Yeah, it's like having difficulty managing those big emotions.
Oh.
Yeah. In a healthy way, you might have those really intense emotional reactions, maybe sudden outbursts, or you might go the other way, and just kind of shut down and numb yourself out.
So basically, the emotional volume is either all the way up or it's off.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. It's so interesting to hear about all of this,
Yeah.
And it's heavy stuff, right?
Yeah, it was.
We've talked about the emotional and the relational impacts, but what about the physical effects? Can this actually impact our physical health?
Absolutely, yeah. We talked about that chronic activation of the stress response, right? And that involves a system in your body called the HPA axis.
Okay.
And when that's constantly triggered, it can lead to things like high blood pressure, problems with sleep, weakened immune system, all sorts of stuff.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, for someone listening who might be recognizing some of these patterns in their own life, what's maybe the first step that they can take?
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to understand all of this.
Yeah, for sure.
But then it's what do I do with this information?
Exactly. And, it's important to acknowledge, this is heavy stuff and healing takes time, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the source points out a few key strategies, and one of the most important ones, and I think it's really the foundation, is seeking professional help, like therapy or counseling.
Okay.
It provides that safe space to process those past traumas.
Right. And it's not about, dwelling on the past, right?
No, not at all.
It's about understanding how those experiences are affecting you today.
Exactly.
And then, figuring out ways to move forward.
And to develop those coping mechanisms, those healthy strategies.
Right, right. And so alongside therapy, it sounds like self-compassion is huge.
Huge, yeah. Absolutely. Recognizing that healing takes time and being gentle with yourself throughout that journey.
Right.
So, instead of beating yourself up for a setback, try acknowledging the difficulty and offer yourself some encouragement.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, being your own best friend rather than your worst critic.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So therapy, self-compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And then what about our support system? Like, does that play a role in healing?
Yeah. For sure. Building those healthy, supportive relationships with people who offer respect and uplift you, that's crucial.
Right.
Those relationships can provide that sense of safety and validation that might have been missing earlier on in life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, you're creating that secure attachment that you maybe didn't have as a child.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really powerful. And then I know the source also talks about boundaries.
Yes.
Which I think is something that a lot of people, especially people who've experienced trauma, struggle with.
Yeah, it can be really challenging.
Yeah.
But it's so important for protecting your mental well-being, being able to say no to toxic behaviors and environments.
Right. And it's not selfish.
No, not at all.
It's about self-preservation.
Exactly.
Right. And then finally, the source mentions mindfulness and self-care, which I think are things that, get talked about a lot these days.
Yeah.
But, they're important.
They are, especially in this context.
Yeah. So what are some of the specific practices that, people can incorporate into their lives?
Yeah. So some of the things that the source mentions are, meditation, journaling, even just taking a few deep breaths throughout the day.
Right.
Those can be incredibly valuable in learning to manage those intense emotions and cultivating that greater sense of inner peace.
And I think it's important to remember, it's not about being perfect at these things.
No.
It's about, just trying.
Yeah, just incorporating them into your routine.
Yeah, exactly.
Little by little.
So, at the end of the day, the big takeaway here is that childhood trauma doesn't have to define.
Exactly. Understanding its effects on you and actively engaging in that healing process, that's what empowers you to take charge of your mental well-being.
Right. And so, I guess, for you, the listener, something to think about is, how might acknowledging the potential roots of some of your current challenges and those early experiences be the first step towards real, lasting, positive change in your life?
That's a great question to reflect on.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive.
Okay.
But this has been a really enlightening conversation, and I hope it's given our listeners a lot to think about.
Absolutely.
So till next time, keep diving deep.
Take care.